The heart monitor suddenly started beeping faster. A doctor stepped closer to the hospital bed and smiled carefully. "Mark, can you hear me?" Mark opened his eyes. Everything looked blurry. The bright room hurt his head. His chest felt heavy. His body ached. He tried to sit up, but pain immediately pushed him back against the pillows. "Easy," the doctor said. "You've been through a serious accident." Mark slowly looked around. The room was crowded. Several well-dressed people stood near his bed. Some looked worried. Some looked nervous. One person had tears in their eyes. Everyone seemed to be waiting for him to say something. The doctor spoke again. "Do you know where you are?" Mark looked around. "No." The doctor nodded calmly. "That's okay. Do you know your name?" A long silence followed. Then Mark answered. "Mark." Relief swept through the room. Several people smiled immediately. One of them stepped closer. "Thank goodness." Mark turned toward the voice. His forehead tightened. Confusion filled his face. He looked at the person, then at everyone else. Then he asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the room. "Who are you people?" The room went silent. Nobody expected that. The smiles disappeared. Several faces turned pale. One person laughed nervously. "Mark, it's us." Mark stared. "I don't know you." The doctor quickly stepped forward. "Mark, you've experienced memory loss. That's normal after the type of injury you've suffered." Mark wasn't listening. His eyes moved around the room again, searching, looking, trying to find something, or someone. Finally, he looked directly at the doctor. "Where is Debra?" The question caught everyone off guard. The doctor blinked. "Who? Debra?" Nobody answered. Mark frowned. "Where is Debra?" Several uncomfortable glances passed across the room. Nobody seemed eager to respond. The doctor tried changing the subject. "Mark, let's focus on getting you comfortable. Where is Debra?" His voice became stronger. The doctor looked toward the people standing nearby. They looked just as confused. One of them folded their arms. Another looked away. Mark's breathing became heavier. "Did somebody call Debra?" Still no answer. The silence only made him more frustrated. He tried sitting up again. The machines attached to his body shifted. A nurse stepped forward. "Please stay calm. Get Debra." "Sir." "Please get Debra." The monitor alarms suddenly started sounding. The room exploded into activity. Doctors rushed forward. Nurses reached for the equipment. Mark grabbed at the wires attached to his chest. "Mark, stop!" But he kept trying to pull them away. "Get Debra! Mark, please calm down." "Where is Debra?" The room froze again. Everyone noticed something strange. Mark couldn't remember the people standing around his bed. He couldn't remember why they were crying. He couldn't remember the life everybody kept telling him he had built. But somehow, he remembered Debra. Over and over he asked the same question. "Where is Debra? Please bring Debra." The people around him looked embarrassed. Some looked angry. Others looked shocked. The billionaire who had forgotten almost everything in his life remembered only one person. And it wasn't any of them. Before we continue, if you believe genuine kindness matters more than money or status, please like this video and leave a comment below. Every like and comment helps YouTube share these stories with more people, and it truly helps our channel grow. Dear God, thank you for the people who stay kind when nobody is watching. Help us recognize real love, real loyalty, and real friendship. Bless every person watching today with peace, wisdom, protection, and hope. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. Meanwhile, somewhere in Alabama, a young housekeeper named Debra had no idea that a billionaire lying in a hospital bed had forgotten almost everything about his life. Except her. Debra almost dropped her phone. She had been finishing her shift when the call came. At first she thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Mark? In a hospital. The words didn't seem to fit together. Only yesterday he had been walking through his Alabama mansion complaining about a business meeting and acting like the world had personally offended him. Now someone was telling her he had survived a serious crash. More confusing than the accident itself was what the caller said next. "He keeps asking for you." Debra frowned. "For me? That's all he's been asking since he woke up." Debra sat down slowly. The news didn't make sense. Mark had family, important people, wealthy people, people who had known him much longer than she had. Why would he be asking for her? She thanked the caller, grabbed her purse, and headed straight for the hospital. The entire drive felt unreal. She prayed quietly. Not for money, not for opportunity, just for Mark to be okay. When she finally arrived, she stepped through the hospital entrance wearing simple clothes and comfortable shoes. No designer labels. No expensive jewelry, no attempt to impress anyone, just concern. A nurse met her near the front desk. "Debra?" "Yes." The nurse looked relieved. "Please come with me." That surprised her. Why would a nurse be relieved to see a housekeeper? As they walked down the hallway, Debra noticed several tense faces outside Mark's room. Nobody looked happy. Nobody looked comfortable. The moment she reached the doorway, she heard Mark's voice. "Where is Debra?" A few seconds later. "Has anybody called Debra?" Debra stopped walking. The nurse opened the door. "She's here." Every head in the room turned. The reaction was immediate. Some faces looked annoyed. Others looked embarrassed. One thing was obvious. Her presence wasn't welcome by everyone. Debra ignored it. Her attention went directly to Mark. The moment their eyes met, something changed. The anxiety disappeared from his face. His shoulders relaxed. The tension left his body. Even the doctor noticed it. "So that's Debra," he quietly said. Mark stared at her, then smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they finally find something they've been searching for. There you are. Debra felt a lump form in her throat. "Hi, Mark." For the first time since waking up, he looked peaceful. The doctor checked the monitor. Even his heart rate had settled. The room became strangely quiet. Nobody could ignore what they were witnessing. Mark couldn't remember basic details about his own life. He couldn't remember important business information. He couldn't clearly identify the people claiming to be closest to him. Yet somehow he remembered Debra. Not everything about her. Not specific dates. Not specific conversations. But he remembered enough. Enough to know she mattered. Debra walked closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" Mark thought for a moment, confused. "That's understandable." He studied her face. "I know you." Debra smiled softly. "Yes. I can't remember why. That's okay." Mark kept looking at her. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed quietly. The doctors exchanged curious looks. "What?" Debra asked. Mark shook his head. "I don't remember much." He paused. "But I remember that you're usually making fun of me." A few surprised chuckles escaped from the nurses. Debra laughed too. "That's because somebody has to keep you humble." The smile on Mark's face grew wider. The room witnessed something remarkable. A man struggling to recognize his own life had just responded naturally to a joke from his housekeeper. Not because he remembered facts. Not because he remembered history. Because somewhere inside his damaged memory, he remembered how she made him feel. Safe, comfortable, human. And that confused everyone. Especially the people who believed they should have been the ones he remembered first. As Debra pulled a chair beside the bed, Mark continued watching her. The question forming in his mind was one he couldn't answer. If his memory was broken, why was her voice the one thing that still felt familiar? Before the crash, before the hospital room, before Mark opened his eyes and asked for Debra like she was the only safe thing left in his world, there was the mansion. It sat behind tall iron gates in Alabama, the kind of place people slowed down to admire even when they pretended not to care. Expensive cars rolled in and out of the driveway. Private dinners were held behind wide glass doors. Men in sharp suits came to talk business. Women with polished smiles came to be seen. From the outside, Mark had everything: money, respect, power. A name people lowered their voices to mention. But inside that mansion, peace was hard to find. Most mornings, Mark walked through the house already dressed for meetings, holding his phone in one hand and a cup of coffee he barely drank in the other. People greeted him with careful smiles. "Good morning, Mark. Big meeting today, Mark. Everyone is expecting you tonight, Mark." Nobody asked if he had slept. Nobody asked if he had eaten. Nobody asked why his eyes looked tired. They only noticed the billionaire, not the man. Debra noticed. She was wiping the long dining table when Mark came in one morning, already frowning at his phone. "You look like that phone owes you money," she said without looking up. Mark stopped. Most people in that house spoke to him like they were afraid one wrong sentence might cost them something. Debra did not. He looked at her. "Good morning to you too." Debra smiled lightly. "I was going to say good morning, but your face. Walked in here arguing first." Mark stared at her for a second. He tried not to laugh. He failed. A short laugh escaped him, surprising even himself. Debra kept wiping the table like nothing had happened. "There it is," she said. "Proof the mansion still has a heartbeat." Mark shook his head. "You always talk this freely while working. Only when rich people look like they forgot joy was free." That time, Mark laughed fully. The sound filled the dining room in a way nobody expected. Across the room, a few well-dressed visitors glanced over, clearly uncomfortable. Debra noticed them looking. She did not shrink. She kept her posture straight, her work neat, and her face calm. She knew some people saw only a housekeeper. But Debra had never believed a job title decided a person's worth. Mark watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. There was something different about her. She did not chase his approval. She did not flatter him. She did not act impressed by the mansion. She simply worked with dignity, spoke with sense, and somehow made the coldest room in his house feel warmer. That morning, Mark walked into his meeting still carrying a small smile. And for the first time in a long while, it had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with Debra. Over the next few weeks, a strange pattern began forming inside the Alabama mansion. Debra noticed it long before Mark did. Every morning, breakfast was prepared. Every morning, breakfast sat untouched. And every morning, Mark somehow convinced himself that coffee counted as a meal. One day, Debra caught him heading toward the front door with his phone pressed against his ear. "Sir?" Mark paused. "What? You forgot breakfast again." "I'll eat later." Debra folded her arms. "You said that yesterday." Mark pointed toward the driveway. "I have a meeting." "You had a meeting yesterday, too." Mark sighed. "You keeping records now?" "No." She nodded toward the dining room. "I'm just watching a billionaire slowly lose a fight against scrambled eggs." Mark rubbed his forehead. "You make everything sound ridiculous, because some things are ridiculous." For a moment, they stared at each other. Then Mark walked back into the dining room. 5 minutes. Debra smiled. "Look at that. Progress." Mark shook his head while sitting down. He hated admitting it, but she was right. Again. As the weeks passed, Debra noticed other things. She noticed when Mark stayed in his office long after everyone else left. She noticed when he spent entire evenings staring out windows instead of relaxing. She noticed how often people came to ask him for favors. Money, influence, connections, access. Everybody seemed to want something. Very few people seemed interested in Mark himself. One afternoon, Debra found him sitting alone in a large living room. A television was playing quietly in the background. Mark wasn't watching it. He was staring at nothing. She placed a glass of water on the table beside him. "You look tired." "I'm fine." Debra laughed softly. "You know, rich people really need a new sentence." Mark looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means every time you're stressed, you say you're fine. I am fine. You just proved my point." Despite himself, Mark smiled. Debra sat in a nearby chair for a moment. "Bad day." Mark leaned back. "Long day." That's usually the answer people give when they don't want to talk about the real answer. He looked at her carefully. Most people avoided conversations like this. Most people changed the subject. Debra never seemed interested in pretending. Before Mark could respond, footsteps approached. Several wealthy visitors entered the room. The atmosphere immediately changed. Their smiles appeared instantly. Their voices became louder. Their attention shifted directly to Mark. Debra stood up. As she passed by, one of them barely acknowledged her existence. Another looked at her as though she didn't belong in the room at all. Debra noticed. She always noticed. But she kept her head high and continued walking. She had spent too many years respecting herself to let someone else's opinion decide her value. Mark watched the entire exchange. Something about it bothered him. After the visitors left later that evening, he found Debra organizing supplies. "You ever get tired of people acting like that?" Debra looked up. "Like what?" "Looking down on you," she shrugged. "I learned a long time ago that people reveal more about themselves than they do about me." Mark considered that. "That doesn't make it annoying." "Oh, it's definitely annoying." That answer made him laugh. Debra laughed too. For a few seconds, the mansion felt less empty, less formal, less lonely. And Mark realized something he hadn't expected. The conversations he enjoyed most each day weren't happening in boardrooms. They weren't happening at private dinners. They weren't happening with people trying to impress him. The moments he looked forward to most involved a housekeeper who wasn't impressed by any of it. For the first time in years, someone treated him like a person before, treating him like a billionaire, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, Mark was beginning to look for Debra whenever she wasn't around. The invitation-only dinner began at sunset. By appearance alone, it looked successful. Expensive food filled the table. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. People smiled. People laughed. People talked about success. But Mark spent most of the evening wishing he were somewhere else. The conversations felt familiar. Not because they were meaningful, because they were always the same. Money, status, power, control, who owned what, who deserved what, who expected more. Mark sat quietly while the discussion grew louder around him. At first, he tried participating. That effort lasted less than 10 minutes. The moment he spoke about slowing down some business plans, room pushed back. The moment he mentioned wanting less pressure, nobody listened. Instead, the conversation returned to money. One person asked about future ownership. Another asked about long-term control. Someone else raised questions about inheritance. Nobody asked Mark how he felt. Nobody asked whether he was happy. Nobody asked whether he was exhausted. The entire evening felt less like a family gathering and more like a business negotiation. Mark leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he simply watched. Watched people talk about his life as if he wasn't sitting there. Watched people discuss his future while ignoring the person who actually had to live it. The longer the evening continued, the heavier the room felt. Eventually, Mark pushed his chair back. The sound interrupted the conversation. Several faces turned toward him. "Leaving already?" someone asked. Mark forced a polite smile. "I've had a long day." The response earned a few nods, then the conversation immediately returned to money. That bothered him more than he expected. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him. Nobody asked if he was okay. Mark walked out of the dining room, through the front hallway and toward the main entrance. As he reached the door, he noticed movement nearby. Debra was finishing part of her evening work. She looked up. "You look tired." Mark laughed softly. "You're starting to sound like a broken record." "Maybe because you're starting to look like one." That earned a small smile. Debra tilted her head. "Everything all right?" Mark considered giving the usual answer. "I'm fine." Instead, he surprised himself. "Not really." Debra nodded. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't offer advice. She simply listened. That alone felt refreshing. After a few seconds, she said quietly, "Get some rest tonight. I'll try." "You better." Mark smiled again. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, that short conversation felt more genuine than the entire dinner he had just left. "Good night, Debra." "Good night, Mark." He stepped outside. Rain had already started falling across the Alabama night. The parking area glistened beneath the lights. Mark climbed into his vehicle and started the engine. For several moments he sat there, thinking, not about money, not about business, not about status. He thought about how strange it was that the easiest conversation of his day had come from the one person who wanted nothing from him. Finally, he pulled away from the mansion. Rain tapped against the windshield. The road stretched ahead through the darkness. Mark drove in silence. A few miles later, the rain grew heavier. Visibility dropped. Headlights blurred. The road became slick. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Then everything happened at once. A sudden flash of light, the sharp sound of tires losing traction, a violent impact, metal twisting, glass breaking, the world spun, and then nothing. Far away, emergency sirens pierced the night. Inside the wreckage, Mark didn't move. Mark woke up to pain. Not sharp all at once, but heavy, deep, confusing. His eyelids opened slowly, and the first thing he noticed was sound. A steady beep, soft footsteps, accident, low voices, someone crying nearby. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. His throat felt dry. His head felt full of fog. A doctor leaned over him carefully. "Mark, can you hear me?" Mark blinked. The doctor's face was unfamiliar. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," the doctor said gently. "You were in Anne." Mark tried to process the words. Hospital. Accident. None of it settled properly in his mind. Several people rushed closer to the bed. Their faces carried worry, but Mark felt no recognition. One person covered their mouth. Another whispered, "Thank God." Mark stared at them. They looked emotional. They looked familiar to each other, but not to him. The doctor asked, "Mark, do you know these people?" Mark looked from one face to another. The room waited. His answer came quietly. "No." A heavy silence followed. Someone began crying harder. Mark frowned. Why are they crying? The question hurt the room. The doctor exchanged a careful look with another medical worker. "Mark, your memory has been affected by the crash. We need to ask you a few questions." Mark swallowed. "What kind of questions? Do you remember where you were before the accident?" Mark closed his eyes. A large table, raised voices, rain, a doorway. A woman's voice saying, "Get some rest tonight." His eyes opened suddenly. "Debra." The room shifted. The doctor paused. "What did you say?" "Where is Debra?" Nobody answered. Mark looked around again, this time with more urgency. "Did somebody call her?" One of the well-dressed people near the bed stiffened. The doctor tried to keep his voice calm. "Mark will contact whoever you need, but right now..." "No," Mark interrupted. "I need Debra." A confused silence filled the room. Someone near the window said, "Why would he ask for her?" Mark heard the tone. He didn't understand the full meaning, but he understood enough to dislike it. "Call her," he said. The doctor stepped back and spoke quietly to a nurse. Mark kept staring at the door. He could not remember the company they mentioned. He could not remember business decisions. He could not remember why the people around him kept acting as if they owned his grief. But Debra's name stayed clear. Her voice stayed close. Her face was not fully sharp in his mind, but the feeling was safe, honest, warm. The doctor asked another question. "Mark, do you remember your home?" He shut his eyes. A mansion appeared in pieces, tall doors, a dining table, coffee, a phone in his hand. Debra saying, "You look like that phone owes you money." A weak laugh escaped him. Everyone stared. The doctor leaned closer. "What do you remember?" Mark whispered. "She made me laugh." That answer made the room uncomfortable. One person looked away. Another folded their arms. The doctor asked, "Who is Debra to you?" Mark struggled for the right answer. He didn't know her title. He didn't know how to explain the peace her name brought him. So he gave the only answer his damaged memory could hold. "She matters." Minutes later, Debra received the call. She was still in Alabama, still wearing her simple work clothes still, thinking about how tired Mark had looked before leaving the mansion. When she heard the word "serious crash," her hand tightened around the phone. When she heard he was awake, she breathed. But when she heard he had been asking for her, she stopped moving completely. "For me?" she asked. The voice on the phone confirmed it. Debra did not waste time. She grabbed her purse and hurried out, praying under her breath as she went. By the time she reached the hospital, her heart was beating fast. She walked through the entrance without fancy clothes, without makeup done for attention, without anything to prove. Only concern carried her forward. A nurse met her near the hallway. "You're Debra?" "Yes. Please come quickly." Debra followed. Outside Mark's room, tension filled the air. Nobody needed to say she was not wanted there. She could feel it. Still, she lifted her chin and stepped forward. The nurse opened the door. "She's here." Mark turned his head. The moment he saw Debra standing in the doorway, his breathing slowed. His eyes softened. And for the first time since waking up, he looked calm. The moment Debra stepped into the hospital room, the atmosphere changed. Mark's shoulders relaxed. The tension that had been sitting on his face since waking up seemed to disappear. Even the doctor noticed it. A few moments earlier, Mark had been restless, confused, frustrated. Now he looked calmer, almost relieved. Debra walked toward the bed slowly. "Hi, Mark." Mark looked at her carefully. The smile returned immediately. "There you are." Debra pulled a chair closer. "I heard you've been causing trouble." A weak laugh escaped him. The doctor looked surprised. That was the second time Mark had laughed since waking up. "Everybody keeps saying that. Maybe because it's true." Mark shook his head. "I don't remember enough to defend myself. Convenient." That earned another laugh. The doctor quietly made notes while observing them. The difference was impossible to ignore. For reasons nobody fully understood, Debra seemed to reach parts of Mark that medicine couldn't. She wasn't performing miracles. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't giving medical advice. She was simply being herself. And somehow that helped. Over the next few days, Debra visited regularly. Whenever she entered the room, Mark brightened. Whenever she left, he watched the door longer than he realized. One afternoon, Mark looked at her curiously. "Tell me something about myself." Debra raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." "Why? Because I know embarrassing information." Mark smiled. "Let's hear it." Debra leaned back. "Well, for starters, you argue with technology. I do not. You absolutely do." The doctor standing nearby chuckled. Debra continued. "I've watched you lose arguments with printers, computers, televisions, and one coffee machine." Mark laughed. "That sounds exaggerated." "No, that's a documentary." The laughter felt good, not just because it was funny, because it felt familiar, like something his heart remembered even when his mind struggled. Another day, Mark asked for more stories. Debra told him about forgotten umbrellas, forgotten meetings, forgotten lunch appointments. She told him how he once spent 10 minutes searching for glasses that were already on his face. Mark buried his face in his hands. "Please tell me you're making that one up." "I'm not. That's embarrassing." It was very entertaining. The room filled with laughter again. For the first time since the crash, Mark wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was simply enjoying the moment. The doctors noticed his progress. His stress levels improved. His mood improved. His willingness to participate in recovery improved. The connection was obvious. But Debra never used it for attention. She never acted important. She never reminded anyone that Mark kept asking for her. She simply showed up, day after day, patient, steady, kind. One evening, after a long conversation, Mark became quiet. Debra noticed immediately. "What is it?" Mark looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I don't remember most people in this room." Debra waited. "But when you're here, I don't feel lost." The honesty caught her off guard. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Debra smiled softly. "You'll find your way." Mark nodded. Maybe, but one thing was already becoming clear. Out of everyone around him, Debra was the person he trusted most, and he couldn't explain why. The days began blending together. Not because they were identical, because Mark measured them differently now. Instead of counting medical appointments, he found himself counting Debra's visits. He never said it out loud, at least not at first. But he noticed. When she entered the room, the day felt lighter, When she left, the room felt larger and somehow emptier. His recovery continued steadily. The doctors were pleased with his progress. His memory still had gaps, large ones, important ones, but small pieces of his life started returning unexpectedly. Sometimes a sound triggered something, sometimes a phrase, sometimes a simple expression on Debra's face. One afternoon, Mark was sitting by the hospital window when Debra arrived carrying a cup of coffee. She placed it on the table beside him. "You look like you're trying to solve a mystery." Mark glanced at her. "Maybe I am. Good luck." He smiled. "That's not encouraging. Neither is staring at a wall for 20 minutes. Mark laughed softly. Then his expression became serious. "Can I ask you something?" Debra pulled up a chair. "Of course." Mark hesitated. It was a question that had been bothering him for days. "Why do I trust you?" The room became quiet. Debra didn't answer immediately. She thought carefully. "Maybe because we've known each other a while. No?" Mark shook his head. "It feels like more than that." Debra remained calm. Mark continued. "I don't remember important details." He pointed toward the hallway. "I don't remember most of the people who keep visiting." His voice lowered. "But every time I see you, something feels familiar." Debra listened without interrupting. Mark looked directly at her. "Why do I feel safe around you?" The question carried more weight than either of them expected. Debra could have used the moment differently. She could have exaggerated their connection. She could have taken advantage of his confusion. She could have told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Instead, she chose honesty. "I don't know." Mark looked surprised. Debra smiled gently. "What I do know is that trust isn't something you force." She shrugged. "Maybe your heart remembers things before your memory does." Mark sat quietly. The answer stayed with him. Outside the room, however, not everyone appreciated their growing bond. The more time Debra spent helping Mark recover, the more uncomfortable certain people became. The looks grew colder. The whispers grew longer. The tension became harder to ignore. Debra noticed it. She simply refused to participate in it. Whenever someone treated her differently, she responded with the same calm confidence she always carried. Mark noticed that too. One afternoon, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Debra had just finished telling him about something funny from before, the accident. Mark suddenly smiled. "What?" Debra asked. Mark stared at the floor. "I remember a dining room." Debra immediately leaned forward. "Really?" He nodded. "I was heading out somewhere." The memory felt distant but real. "You stopped me." Debra smiled. "Oh no." Mark laughed. "You told me I forgot breakfast." Now Debra laughed too. "I remember that. You said something about scrambled eggs. You deserved it." Mark shook his head. "I think you enjoyed being right." "I absolutely enjoyed being right." The conversation continued. Another memory followed. Then another. Not major events. Not business meetings. Not financial decisions. Simple moments. Small moments. Moments involving Debra, the woman who reminded him to eat. The woman who spoke honestly when others chose flattery. The woman who treated him like a human being instead of a billionaire. That realization stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, Debra stood to leave. "Get some rest." Mark smiled. "That sounds familiar." "It should." She headed toward the door. Before she reached it, Mark spoke again. "Debra." She turned around. "Yeah?" For a moment he simply looked at her. Then he smiled. A genuine smile, one that came from somewhere deeper than memory. "I'm glad you're here." Debra felt her heart tighten. She smiled back. "I'm glad you're getting better." As she walked out, Mark watched her go. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. His memory was returning piece by piece, and every piece seemed to lead back to the same person. Not because she wanted something from him, not because she chased his wealth, but because her kindness had left a mark strong enough to survive the crash. Mark's recovery moved slowly, but his questions started moving faster. At first, the doctors wanted him to focus only on rest, therapy, and simple memory exercises. Mark tried. He really did. But every time certain people entered his hospital room, the same uneasy feeling returned. They smiled too quickly. They spoke too softly. They asked careful questions. Not about his pain, not about his sleep. Not about whether the headaches were improving. They asked about documents, passwords, business access, appointments he could not remember. One afternoon, Mark sat upright in bed while Debra adjusted the blanket near his chair. A few visitors had just left the room, and the silence they left behind felt heavier than their presence. Mark looked toward the door. "Did you hear what they kept asking?" Debra paused. "I heard enough. They asked about control papers before they asked if I could walk." "Without help?" Debra's face softened. "Mark," he looked at her. "Tell me the truth. Was it always like this?" Debra did not rush to answer. That was one reason he trusted her. She never filled silence with fake comfort. Finally, she said, Some people around you cared too much about what you owned. Mark stared down at his hands. And did I know? Debra nodded slowly. I think part of you did. That answer stayed with him. Later that day, Mark requested access to his recent personal decisions. The process took time because his recovery still limited what he could handle, but he insisted on reviewing what had been happening before the crash. When the papers were finally placed before him, his eyes moved slowly across the pages. Some words were familiar, some were not, but one detail caught his attention. He had already started changing major control arrangements before the accident. Mark read the page twice, then a third time. His breathing changed. Debra noticed. What is it? Mark looked up. I started changing things. What things? Estate access, business authority, decision rights. Debra stepped closer, confused. Before the crash? Yes. She shook her head gently. I didn't know anything about that. I know. Mark said it immediately. Debra looked at him, surprised by how certain he sounded. He continued, You didn't know because this had nothing to do with you. Debra's eyes searched his face. Then why change it? Mark looked back at the papers. His memory still had gaps, but his instincts were beginning to return. I think I was tired of being treated like a vault with a heartbeat. The words settled between them. Debra sat down slowly. For once she had no joke ready. Mark touched the edge of the papers. I don't remember every decision yet, but I understand this feeling. What feeling? He looked toward the door again. The feeling that the people closest to my money were not always close to me. Debra stayed quiet. Mark leaned back, tired but clearer than before. They made me feel guilty for trusting you. Debra lowered her eyes. I never wanted to stand between you and anybody you didn't. His voice became firm. You stood beside me when nobody was asking how heavy my life had become. Debra swallowed, emotional but controlled. Mark looked at the papers again. The truth was no longer hiding behind memory loss. Before the crash, he had already sensed the danger around him. Before the hospital, before the confusion, before everyone acted concerned, he had already begun protecting himself. And now he understood why. His memory had been damaged. But his instincts had been right all along. The confrontation began on a quiet afternoon. Mark had spent most of the morning reviewing more information about his life before the accident. Not financial numbers, not company reports. The more he learned, the more uncomfortable he became. By now, he understood something important. His memory loss had not created his doubts. It had only exposed them. Debra was sitting beside the hospital window reading a magazine she had barely touched for 20 minutes. Mark noticed. You haven't turned that page once. Debra looked up. I was thinking, about what? You, Mark smiled. That sounds dangerous. It probably is. Before either could continue, the hospital room door opened. Several visitors entered together. The atmosphere changed immediately. Mark felt it. Debra felt it too. Nobody looked happy. Nobody looked relaxed. One person crossed their arms. Another looked directly at Debra. The expression wasn't friendly. Mark sat straighter. What is it? Nobody answered immediately. Then one of them finally spoke. This has gone far enough. Mark frowned. What has? The response came quickly. Her. The room became silent. Debra lowered the magazine. Mark's expression hardened. What about her? The answer surprised nobody except perhaps the person speaking it. We think she's influencing you. Debra froze. Mark stared. The accusation hung in the air. Another voice joined in. Ever since the accident, you've been listening to her more than anyone. Debra immediately shook her head. That's not true. But they continued. You're making decisions while confused. You're trusting the wrong person. She works for you. The words kept coming. Each accusation sounded worse than the one before. Mark watched Debra carefully. What stood out wasn't anger. It was hurt. Real hurt. Because she had spent weeks helping him without asking for anything in return. And now she was being treated like a threat. Debra slowly stood. Maybe I should go. Mark looked at her immediately. No. The firmness in his voice surprised everyone, including Debra. Mark turned back toward the group. Nobody is leaving. The room became quiet again. One person pointed toward Debra. You can't seriously believe she isn't benefiting from this. Mark stared. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mark asked a simple question. Tell me something. The room waited. When I woke up after the crash, what did you ask me about first? Nobody answered. Mark continued. Was it my pain? My recovery? My health? Mark nodded slowly. That's what I thought. The truth was becoming impossible to avoid. He looked directly at the people accusing Debra. Then he looked at Debra, then back again. His voice remained calm, but every word landed heavily. Debra never asked me for money. Nobody spoke. Debra never asked me for control. Silence. Debra never asked me for anything. The room seemed smaller now. Mark took a slow breath. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. Debra visited me when everyone else visited my bank account. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody had a response. Nobody could argue with it. The truth was sitting in the middle of the room for everyone to see. Debra had shown up because she cared. Not because she expected something. Not because she was chasing power. Simply because she was worried about him. Mark looked around the room. For the first time since the accident, he felt completely certain. His memory was still healing, but his judgment wasn't broken. Not anymore, he continued. When I couldn't remember my own life, she treated me like a person. Nobody interrupted. When I was confused, she was patient. Still nobody spoke. When I was scared, she stayed. The accusations collapsed under the weight of reality. The room had no defense against the truth. Debra stood quietly. Emotion filled her eyes. Not because Mark defended her. Because someone had finally acknowledged what she had been carrying all along. Respect, real respect. Not because of her job, not because of money, because of her character. After a long silence, the tension finally broke. The people who had accused her had nothing left to say. One by one, they looked away. Mark turned toward Debra. A small smile appeared. The same smile that had become familiar during recovery. Debra smiled back. For the first time since the accident, neither of them felt like they needed to explain anything. The truth had already done the work, and in that hospital room, justice finally arrived. Mark's memory did not return all at once. It came back in pieces. Some pieces were small, a hallway, a dinner table, a cup of coffee sitting untouched. Debra's voice telling him, "You forgot breakfast again." Some pieces made him smile. Others made him quiet. But each memory helped him understand the life he had been living before the crash. He remembered the mansion. He remembered the expensive dinners. He remembered the polished smiles that always seemed to disappear when he stopped being useful. He remembered feeling tired even inside rooms full of people. And then he remembered Debra. Not just her name, not just her face. He remembered the way she spoke to him without fear. He remembered how she never acted impressed by his money. He remembered how she noticed when he skipped meals, when his smile felt forced when he was standing in a room but somehow still alone. One afternoon after therapy, Mark sat near the hospital window while Debra helped arrange the small table beside him. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said. Debra glanced at him. "Doing what? Taking care of things." She gave him a look. "Mark, if I leave this table the way you arranged it, somebody might report it as a natural disaster." He laughed. The sound came easier now. "You always have something to say, and you always give me material." Mark smiled, but his expression slowly softened. "I remember more now." Debra paused. "Good memories, or the kind that make you want to throw something?" "A little of both." She sat down across from him. Mark looked at her carefully. "I remember the night before the crash." Debra's face changed. "I told you to get some rest. You did. You looked worn out. He took a breath. "But I also remember something else." Debra waited. "I remember wishing I could stay and talk to you instead of going. Anywhere else." The room became quiet. Debra looked down for a second, but not because she was ashamed. The truth had landed close to her heart. Mark continued gently. "I think I cared about you before the accident." Debra looked back at him. "You think?" A small smile touched his face. "I know." She tried to cover the emotion with humor. "Well, that memory seems to be working just fine." Mark reached for her hand, then stopped. He looked at her first, silently asking permission. Debra noticed. That small respect touched her more than any expensive gift could have. She placed her hand in his. Mark held it carefully. "I don't want you to feel pressured because of what happened," he said. "I don't want confusion, gratitude, or loneliness to turn into something unfair to you." Debra's eyes softened. "That's the first smart thing you've said all week." Mark laughed quietly. "I'm serious, I know." She squeezed his hand. "I cared too, Mark." He went still. Debra looked directly at him. "I tried not to. You were my boss. You came from a different world. People already looked at me like I was standing where I didn't belong. You always belonged." Her voice lowered. "I cared because you were kind when you forgot how to be happy. I cared because sometimes, under all that money and stress, I could see a man who just needed someone honest near him." Mark held her hand a little tighter. "Debra." She shook her head gently. "But we go slow," he nodded immediately. "As slow as you want, no secret feelings hiding behind hospital walls. No secrets. No treating me like I need rescuing. I won't, and no acting like a billionaire when common sense is required." Mark smiled. "That one might take practice." Debra laughed softly. For the first time, the feeling between them no longer needed to hide behind jokes, recovery, or confusion. It was honest now. Gentle. Careful. Real. Mark looked at their joined hands. So, what is the first step? Debra smiled. You get better, and after that, you take me somewhere simple. Simple? Yes. Real food. Normal chairs. No one discussing inheritance over dessert. Mark laughed, and this time the laugh carried hope. Deal. That afternoon, their relationship took its first official step forward. Not with a grand promise, not with money, not with pressure, but with two people choosing honesty, respect, and patience. And for Mark, that felt like the beginning of a life he actually wanted to remember. Several months later, life looked very different. Not because Mark had become a different man, because he had finally become an honest one. His recovery continued well. Most of his memory had returned. The headaches became less frequent. The confusion faded. The hospital visits ended. But the biggest change wasn't medical. It was personal. For the first time in years, Mark stopped building his life around other people's expectations. He spent less time entertaining people who only appeared when they wanted something. He stopped attending gatherings that left him exhausted. He stopped chasing approval from people who measured worth using money. Instead, he focused on peace. Real peace. The kind he had spent years searching for without realizing it. And somehow that peace often involved Debra. Some things about Debra never changed. She remained honest. She remained grounded. She remained the same woman who would tell him when he was being stubborn. One Saturday afternoon, Mark was helping carry folding chairs for a community celebration in Alabama. Debra watched him struggle with a stack that was clearly too large. You know you could make 2 trips. Mark adjusted the chairs. I believe in efficiency. You believe in showing off. I am carrying chairs, and somehow making it dramatic. Mark laughed. The sound earned a smile from Debra. That had become one of her favorite sounds. Not because it was rare anymore, because it was genuine. The celebration filled the neighborhood with music, conversation, food, and laughter. Unlike the formal events Mark used to attend, nobody seemed interested in status. People talked. People helped. People checked on one another. The atmosphere reminded him of something Debra once said. Food is love. For the first time, he understood exactly what she meant. Throughout the afternoon, Mark watched Debra move through the crowd. She greeted people warmly, helped where needed, listened when someone spoke. Nothing about her changed after learning she was important to him. Nothing about her changed after learning she was loved. And Mark admired that more than anything. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued, Mark stood and gently tapped a glass. The nearby conversations quieted. Debra immediately looked suspicious. Oh no, Mark smiled. Oh yes. She narrowed her eyes. What are you doing? Something I should have done a long time ago. People turned toward them. Mark took a slow breath. Years ago, speaking in front of a crowd would have been easy. This felt different, because this mattered. He looked directly at Debra. When I had everything, I thought success meant being respected. The crowd listened. Then I learned that respect and affection aren't the same thing. Debra stood quietly. Mark continued. When life became difficult, I discovered something important. His voice softened. The people who truly care about you aren't always the people standing closest to your money. A few people nodded. Mark smiled toward Debra. This woman spent years treating me like a human being when it would have been easier to treat me like a billionaire. Debra immediately shook her head. Mark. But he wasn't finished. She reminded me to eat. Laughter spread through the crowd. Frequently, more laughter followed. She told me the truth when I needed it. Debra covered her face, embarrassed. And when my life changed, she never changed who she was. The crowd applauded. Debra's eyes filled with emotion. Not because she enjoyed attention, because she knew Mark meant every word. Mark walked toward her. The applause continued. He stopped beside her and gently took her hand. The same hand she had placed in his hospital room months earlier. The same hand that had helped guide him through recovery. The same hand that never reached for his money, only for him. I spent years living in a large house, Mark said quietly enough for only Debra to hear. And I finally found home. Debra laughed through tears. That was almost too smooth. Almost? Don't get carried away, Mark smiled. I love you. The words came naturally. No audience pressure. No dramatic performance. Just truth. Debra looked into his eyes. The answer arrived immediately. I love you too. The celebration erupted into cheers. Mark laughed. Debra laughed. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt simple. Not perfect. Not complicated. Just honest. The crash had taken many things from him. But it had also forced him to see what mattered most. Money could build walls. Money could build estates. Money could open doors. But money could never replace genuine care. That came from people. From character. From love. And sometimes the person others overlook becomes the person who changes everything. Thank you for spending time with us today on Love, Money, and Secret. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. Share it with someone you care about. and leave a comment telling us what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you're not already part of our family, subscribe to Love, Money, and Secret for more inspiring stories filled with love, life lessons, hope, and second chances. Because sometimes the greatest treasure in life isn't what you own. It's who stands beside you when everything else falls away.